in response to the question, how would you rewrite the creed? And of course, in a sense, I wouldn't, because my theology isn't a set of quasi-metaphysical convictions about what there is out there. It takes entirely different form. So that's why I'm a sort of radical rather than a liberal. I think liberal revisionists want to revise the product but keep basic continuity with tradition. Whereas I think that the age we're now in is getting to be so different from previous epochs that we have to think again our whole worldview and our conception of what religion is and what part it might play in human life. So here's my little creed then, beginning with the fact that for me there is no fixed and unchanging reality out there, and the whole idea of a ready-made world has to be given up. Instead, the world is an endless debate between a large number of different points of view. Everything in life is transient and contingent and always subject to changing human interpretations. No unchanging and objective metaphysical order underlies the world. That's to say, there is no better beyond. That whole way of thinking has gone. In that case, a religious creed can no longer take the form of a declaration of belief in something out there that determines our fate on the basis of our relation to it. Instead, our creed should be about our relation to life and to our own lives in particular. Rudolf Bultmann, I think, began introducing this conception of what creed might be. It might be about your self-understanding of your situation and how you should live. Hence these little propositions. They're just an example of large numbers of similar summaries I've written at one time or another, and this one's about true religion. True religion is your own voice if you can but find it. That's to say, the traditional notion of correct doctrine I replace by the notion of truthfulness. For years and years and years I've been trying to write a religious book that I felt was truthful, and that was without illusion, that was without any illusions or in no way an attempt to trick the reader. True religion is to learn to talk about yourself, your situation as a human being, your life with others, in a way that strikes you as being genuine and honest and truly your own. It takes around 20 years to find your own voice in the arts, and it seems to take equally long in religion. Think of all those great painters I was talking about earlier, of the mid and later 19th century. It took many of them 20 years to learn to speak with their own voice when just painting a picture. Van Gogh only reached it in the last couple of years of his life. True religion is in every sense to own one's own life, and I say in every sense because, of course, to own is to confess, to acknowledge as one's own, to accept full responsibility for, and so on. True religion is to own one's own life. Thirdly, true religion is the pure solar affirmation of life in full acknowledgement of its utter gratuitousness, its contingency, its transience, and even its nothingness. I use the word solar because of the metaphor of the sun, which simply is its own self-outpouring. The same process by which it lives is also the process by which it dies. It's like a fire. It just is its own self-outpouring. Well, we ought to be able to live like that, with that sort of complete and unreserved commitment to life, fragile, brief and so on, though life is. We shouldn't be held back by a Puritan fear and dread of life, or indeed fear and dread of the passage of time. Notoriously in relation to, for example, sex, we hate to admit that time is passing and we're getting older, and in one way or another we fight the passage of time. Well, time passes, it just does. There's no alternative. It makes no sense to try to deny change. Fourthly, true religion is productive, value-realizing action in the public world. Although, for me, there is no ready-made moral order out there, for me, we are the only makers of morality. We give things value by our care for them. That doesn't mean we inherit a situation of absolute moral nihilism. On the contrary, we always come into a social morality already in place. Our society has already annexed a value to everything. The way we value everything, as was noticed in the 60s, is given by the way we talk about it, the language in which we speak of it. And if we're dissatisfied with the way something or other is valued, we've got to change the way it talks about. We've got to persuade other people to value it higher. And in general, in ethics, my principle is we should value everything in life as highly as we self-consistently can. Of course, you can't value everything equally. Life contains all sorts of contradictions and oppositions. But you should hold as consistently affirmative an attitude as you can. Here I'm coming back again to my attempt at a purely affirmative conception of morality, and notice it's linked with my moral non-realism. I don't think there's any moral order out there prior to us. All there is the human valuations of things that we've inherited from the past, as we inherit culture, as we inherit the knowledge of the last generation. So true religion is, so to say, to persuade people to revalue things that you think are undervalued. We became aware of this when we were first debating the language in which people talk about men and women and about black people and so on in the 60s. The language people habitually use sometimes needs to be changed. We need to argue for a different vocabulary. And finally, faith. I don't see faith in terms of holding on to anything, because the whole idea of holding on, I think, has to be given up. People tend to think that there are or should be fixed points in life, things that never change, things we can be quite sure of, things that we can cling to, and I suggest we should give up such ideas as Buddhists do, and instead we should see faith as learning to let go and float, having the courage to be free-floating. Elementary lesson. It reminds me, isn't it, of the American wood duck, which nests up trees. And the first step the ducklings have to take in life is to fling themselves out of the nest and land in the leaf litter at the foot of the tree, and then they get themselves up and walk off. It's a very funny sight. We keep them in the college pond at Emmanuel College. Faith is not a holding on. We should see faith as a letting go, a willing to take risk. And as I'm saying, I've been trying to argue not just for an eccentric point of view of my own, I've also been arguing that increasingly this point of view is actually coded into our language. A word of which I did do a little study a few weeks ago was the word belief and the related word faith in ordinary language. and I collected 30 or 40 belief idioms, and was very struck to find that for ordinary people, belief is not seen in intellectualist terms as a matter of convictions about what is the case held by the intellect. On the contrary, belief is a matter of standing by, of what you can trust, of what you're loyal to, of what you can safely take for granted day by day, as it were. Belief is seen in terms of trust and loyalty. It's closely related to the word beloved, of course. And so the ordinary language has that moral and pragmatic quality to it. It's not, in fact, very Platonic at all, even after all these centuries of Platonism. Ordinary language sees belief in terms of what you stand by, what you live by. So I'm arguing then that this popular religion, the one that we show we have in our idioms, is in many ways the natural fulfillment of ideas already present in the older religious traditions. So in Christianity, for example, my point of view, something like it, developed in the Lutheran tradition through the work of people like Luther himself, Kierkegaard, and Bultmann. It was Luther who very strongly stressed the appropriation of religious belief. Appropriation means making one's own, making it proper to oneself, making it one's own, and building it into your way of living in such a way that when you've fully appropriated your religious beliefs, they're no longer creed or convictions, they're just the shape of the way you live. And that's why I'm not ashamed to say that in the end we should move to what used to be called a non-cognitive philosophy of religion. In the English-speaking world, non-cognitive philosophies of religion first began to be put forward in the 1960s. And I remember at that time I was a conservative and most of the English were and so on. And I was rather horrified by them, but I now begin to see the advantages of a non-cognitive philosophy of religion, which stresses living and loyalty and stories more than doctrinal convictions. I think the older sort of theology and the older sort of understanding of creed was very strongly tied up with the power of the church. And the creed that you believed and the church to which you were subject belonged to an age of mediated religion when first-hand religious living was not really possible. You were living under authority in a transitional period. Church Christianity assumes that we're, like the Israelites in the wilderness, on the way, marching like a mighty army, under orders, living by a kind of military law of the church's own, and so on. If we now see, in the second axial period, that age of disciplinary religion coming to an end, it's not surprising that people should take a non-realist view of religious doctrine. What's valuable in it we should assimilate, and what isn't valuable we can do without. And by assimilation I mean adopt into our way of living. That's why I say that religion in our time should become fully life-centered, and we're less interested than we used to be in building up the size and the power of the church as a supernatural institution. I know when I was younger and very conservative, I did attach great importance to building up the strength and authority of the church. That was what you were supposed to spend your life doing. That was your prime religious duty, as if the church itself was the religious object. But that way of thinking I'm now sceptical about. I still like going to church, but I don't, as it were, fetishize the church, and I'm wary of its tendency to get obsessed with its own power. In any case, for me, there is no supernatural order. Outsidelessness means radical immanence. The traditional division of the world into two different great zones, the natural and the supernatural, nature and grace, seems to have come to an end. Instead, theology has become narrative, and its single most important task in our time is to keep telling and retelling the story of how we got to where we are and where we think we're going. Nearly everybody we find in the Sea of Faith, nearly everybody has some sort of story to tell of their own journey through life. Nowadays, everybody's a pilgrim. Everybody has a spiritual autobiography that they need to tell, need to articulate. Everyone seeks for the meaning of their life by telling the story of the journey they've taken and trying to work out why it took this route, where they started from and where they're going. There's an interesting German philosopher called Blumenberg who wrote a great big book called The Legitimacy of the Modern Age. And he says in that book that since the modern decline of religion began, we've all felt a bit guilty about having departed from a relatively simple faith of our ancestors, and we've had a feeling that the modern world lacks legitimacy, as if we were like Adam and Eve just after they'd sinned and been expelled from Eden and are wandering hand in hand through a hostile world, not knowing where they're going, with the hope of eventual successful outcome to their journey almost infinitely far away. Well, we need to get rid of that idea that the modern age is intrinsically sinful because it's broken away from its sacred origins. It's left Eden. Instead, we need to find new ways of telling the religious meaning of our own time. That's why one of the suggestions I made is that we perhaps see it as kingdom religion, that we're moving beyond the ecclesiastical period to something more like the kingdom period envisaged by the Old Testament prophets for the end of history. It's a difficult and important job to tell this story, not just on the scale of your own life, but on a larger scale too, of what's been happening to Western Christianity and to humanity as a whole. But the rise of modern critical thinking, modern science, modern democracy, as a self-revising, endlessly evolving political setup, all this makes us different from any previous sort of human beings. And we don't yet know where we're going in the long run. We need to keep telling and retelling the story of where we've come from, where we're going, what we're hoping for, what we're aiming at. I'm suggesting, as I've said, that we should now be reading traditional doctrine non-realistically as programming us for living. Let me give one or two examples of the non-realistic interpretation of religious doctrine. The doctrine of the creation of the world by God in 7 days, I read as telling us we should treat life as a gift. A gift indeed that's renewed continuously from day to day. Treat life as a pure gift is, as it were, the ethical way of living the doctrine of creation. And similarly with the doctrine of providence. The old claim was that a wise and kindly providence watches over you, protects you from harm all your life. Well, there's no guarantee you won't in fact have an accident, and it might be better to read the doctrine of providence non-realistically and say, if we stick to our values, if we never give up, we will come through. Something like that was what Paul Tillich proposed to substitute for the traditional doctrine of providence. And indeed, in some ways, Tillich was a forerunner of the point of view I'm trying to describe. Or again, the incarnation. If we see God as a spiritual an ideal of love, Christ may be seen as embodying that ideal in a human life and in the tradition of his teaching. And similarly, I mentioned the resurrection already. I mentioned also the ascension. To read the doctrine of the ascension non-realistically is to see it as asking us to put Christ first in our own lives, to care about his values. And through all the ups and downs of my thought over the last 20 or 30 years, I've retained a very strong affection and attachment to the tradition of Jesus and his teaching. I hope something of that will remain, even if in the future Jesus is only one of a number of other teachers, including the Buddha, whom we'll remember in the same way. And finally, I want to say a few words about nihilism and our response to it. Because I say that the only world we've got is a world we made ourselves as we struggle to evolve social relationships with each other and a common world picture, to evolve that out of nothing but the chaos, the initial chaos of our sense experience and language. We've slowly built up an ever-changing and more elaborate world picture ourselves. We are its only makers, and we have no quite independent check of it. Because I say that, people who think this way are usually accused of nihilism. There is no ready-made reality and truth of things out there. There's no ready-made value out there. We're responsible for it all. Well, that's not quite the case, because we're always within a tradition. We inherit a world picture, we inherit an ethic, we inherit a culture. And our response to nihilism I usually summarize under three heads. The first is the ethics of value creation. And by that I mean simply what I've said already, that the value we currently assign to everything is given by the language in which we speak of it, and it is up to us, in debate with others, to persuade people to revalue something and change the way they speak of it. Values all over the place are rather like the values, the way painters and writers are valued. It's an erratic sort of business. Their market value goes up and down from day to day. Some people seem permanently to suffer from a blighted reputation. We feel they're undervalued and may perhaps become their advocates. But my suggestion is it's up to us all to care for our own bit of the world and to value every aspect of life as highly as we consistently can. And I further say, so far as possible, though there must be things we utterly reject and condemn and want nothing to do with, the conquest of evil, to me, belongs primarily to politics, whereas the giving of meaning and value to life is what belongs to religion. In social ethics, I like the humanitarian tradition, which I believe represents a secularization of Christian ethics, and a correct one. Oddly enough, humanitarianism is a surprisingly recent word. The practice of humanitarian ethics goes back as far as an English retired sea captain called Thomas Coram, who raised money and started a hospital for foundlings, the first orphanage in London in about 1720. His name is remembered here and there, but that was one of the first great humanitarian actions in our tradition. Just an ordinary sea captain, a middle-aged man, badgered aristocrats to cough up the money to build the first orphanage for abandoned children. Out of that grew all sorts of things, like the anti-slavery movement, as the 18th century went on, and modern philanthropy began to take shape. But remember that humanitarianism was severely criticised as do-gooding and as being weak and so on, right through the 19th century, and the word has only come into really common use quite recently. Important milestones are things like the founding of the Red Cross in the 1870s. I like humanitarian ethics because of its typically non-realist insistence that we owe a duty of care to other human beings, not on the basis of their race or creed or sex or colour or whatever, not on the basis of anything like that, but simply on the basis of their co-humanity and their need. All the traditional reasons for discriminating different categories of human being are rejected. I like the ethical nihilism of humanitarians, who say that there's no other worthwhile and morally good starting point for ethical theory but another human being's need, co-humanity, the milk of human kindness. Meaning, notice, that the gift of milk is the expression of co-humanity. Anyway, mother to baby, human kindness means human kinship, in Shakespeare's phrase. Humanitarianism in social ethics then, and in personal ethics or spirituality, solarity, giving oneself completely to life without the holding back, which is such a temptation. So my response to nihilism doesn't attempt an intellectual denial of it, but rather a sort of religious affirmation of it almost. You could say that the huge split nowadays between fundamentalism and radicalism in religion is over this kind of issue. When we glimpse the void, when we see the groundlessness of modern existence, how do we react? Do we clutch at ancient certainties, ancient distinctions and so on? Are we a sort of authoritarian neoconservatives who try by force to keep an old order going? Or are we willing to accept transience, contingency, even nihilism, and make religion out of it? So that question of the response to nihilism is, I think, the question I better leave with you now for discussion.